Good morning and welcome to all participants to the session, Trading in a Greener Environment, Can Australia's Agriculture Exports Maintain Competitive Advantage? I'm Jo Grainger. I'm the Minister Councillor Agriculture. I lead the Ag team here in the European Union in Brussels, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's session. We will shortly hear from Australia's Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, the Honourable Dan Tegan, with some opening remarks. Just before that, some housekeeping. You can submit and upvote questions during the presentations via the menu on the left. The live Q&A will be at the end of the presentations, and we'll endeavour to get to as many questions as possible. If the speaker has given permission, their slides will be available in the Resources tab for you to download. And the session will be recorded and it'll be available under the Session Catch-Up tab after 24 hours. So let's get started, and I welcome Minister Tegan.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to address this ABARES virtual 2022 conference. Australians understand and support the need to take action on climate change. So does the coalition government. So does Australia's farm industry groups that are incorporating sustainability into their industry plans. Business and governments around the world are increasingly embedding environmental and climate change considerations into trade relationships. Our government believes the best approach to reducing emissions is to incentivise, not penalise. Our government is supporting sustainable practices that are now mainstream. Over 95% of farms use minimum or no-till farming. Farmers are planting trees and fencing off riverbanks to protect waterways. And they're destocking during dry periods to maintain ground cover during drought. These are all now routine ways to manage an Australian farm. And the statistics tell a great story. Our rice growers are using 50% less water than the global average. Our cotton farmers have reduced synthetic insecticide use by 97% over the last 3 decades. And our red meat sector has a world-leading ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030. And you can already buy steak and sausages in Australia from a carbon neutral supply chain. That shows you Australian farmers and producers are doing fantastic work to improve sustainability of agricultural exports. So when we think of trading in a greener environment, we should be thinking about ways to incentivise, not penalise. By providing incentives, we can help reduce carbon emissions and also support more trade and create new jobs and opportunities. Our government's support of incentives over penalties is why we oppose carbon border adjustment tariffs and instead advocate for the elimination of tariffs on environmental goods and services. We are concerned the EU's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism is protectionism in another guise, and the last thing the globe needs is further protectionism as we come out of a global pandemic. Australia is strongly committed to an effective global response to climate change. The Prime Minister has said very clearly, our commitment is to deliver net zero emissions by 2050. And to achieve that goal, we're far better off embracing industry innovation and practices by adopting supportive government policies. Rather than introducing new protectionist mechanisms, our government is working with other countries to support the transition to net zero emission through lower carbon emissions and promoting green industries. For example, we are currently negotiating a green economy agreement with Singapore, which is a world-first agreement that combines trade, economic and environmental objectives. This agreement will reduce barriers to trade in environmental goods and services, foster convergence on regulation and standards, explore new opportunities in green growth sectors, adopt environmental measures that facilitate trade and investment, and ensure a smooth transition into a green economy. In conclusion, Australian farmers and agricultural producers are world famous for their problem-solving, innovation and resilience. In these traits, in combination with low-emission technologies and sustainable practices, we will ensure Australia remains a world-leading agriculture producer. We need government and industry working together on solutions that incentivise, not penalise, to fully take advantage of the emerging opportunities in green trade. And you have a commitment from our government to do just that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister, for your introduction. So our first panellist today is Dr. Emma Aisbett. She's a fellow at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at ANU, and she's the Associate Director Research for the Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Grand Challenge. Welcome, Emma.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm excited to be talking to you today about trade-related climate policy developments and opportunities for Australian agriculture. Firstly, what is trade-related climate policy? These are policies which are nominally to support climate objectives, but which have trade and trade policy consequences. Examples of trade-related climate policy are carbon border adjustment mechanisms, preferential green good liberalisation, green standards and certification, and even international carbon markets. Some leading examples of these policies are, of course, the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal that was announced last year, but which importantly doesn't yet include agriculture and may never. But other countries and economies beyond the European Union are also considering carbon border adjustment mechanisms, including the US, Japan, and Canada. Preferential green goods liberalisation, the most pertinent for Australian context and for the region, is in fact the APEC green goods list, which is since 2012 actually been the only sort of officially endorsed green goods preferential liberalisation list in existence. APEC are currently considering expanding this list, and it's important to note here that back in 2012, Indonesia was really keen that palm oil, one of their biofuels, be included in the list. It wasn't that time around, but it's something to watch if negotiations are opened up about an expansion of the list. Green or sustainability certification and standards is something that the agricultural sector has probably been aware of long before most other sectors, because there are important examples from forestry as well, and biofuels are once again a leading example of that standards approach, once again led by the Europeans. Something that Australia is leading, particularly regionally at the moment, is international carbon markets, and the Australian government is actively looking into the Indo-Pacific Carbon Offset Scheme and has recently asked the Climate Change Authority to deliver some really timely work on development of this scheme. So these are all potentially really big drivers of change in agricultural trade internationally. But what are the drivers of these policy changes? The proximate or underlying driver for these changes is increased climate change mitigation ambition on behalf of not only governments, but citizens and corporations around the world. This climate ambition leads to stronger climate policies domestically in many countries, and in particular in the European Union, which in turn can lead to competitive concerns for the companies and the agricultural sector in those countries and economies. If they have to meet higher standards, the idea is that they will be at a competitive disadvantage if those standards are not extended to their import competition. Closely related to these competitiveness concerns are leakage concerns. The idea being that if higher standards are demanded in one economy, then business might move elsewhere to avoid those standards, leading to an overall sort of not much gained in terms of the global carbon emissions. Finally, as we're seeing, including here in the ACT where I live, there are genuine sort of scope 3 or life cycle concerns. So consumers and corporations as well as governments are starting to think not about only the emissions coming from what they directly do when they produce things or when they consume things, but also the emissions that were associated with the production of the goods and services that they consume. These are sort of scope 3 or life cycle emissions concerns. And last but not least, governments and citizens in leading economies in terms of climate change mitigation may be wishing that they could do something beyond their own borders, wanting to influence in a positive way other economies to raise the level of their climate ambition. This is once again a driver for trade-related climate policy, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms in particular. Of course, state actors and policy with a capital P are only one of the things affecting international agricultural trade at the moment, in particular with relation to climate. There are a lot of non-state actors involved in what we call transnational governance. So you get private and multi-stakeholder initiatives like the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Scheme, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. The Race to Zero Climate Ambition Alliance, which is established under the UNFCCC and is an alliance of both countries and corporations, as well as non-government organisations and regions and cities with net zero commitments. And last but certainly not least, a lot of the biggest multinational corporations in the world, who of course control a lot of global trade, have made net zero supply chain commitments, which of course influences things all the way back upstream to where the primary producers are. So change can lead to a lot of uncertainty and can be frightening. But I think it's really important to remember that this actually is a huge opportunity for Australian agriculture. And indeed, I am probably preaching to the converted with many of the people in the audience today who know much more about the amazing things that are already going on in our agricultural sector. Australian agriculture is and always has been innovative. Australian farmers can develop and adopt novel practices and systems faster than most of their competitors. Australian farms also have an advantage that's beyond their own human capital, and that is with our natural capital. We have excellent opportunities, world best opportunities to combine farming with solar or wind, so-called agrivoltaics. We can also think, as we're also already seeing under development in the United States, for example, about the win-win gains in terms of water conservation and energy generation if we use photovoltaic covers for our dams, our large dams, and our large irrigation channels. Australian soils are, of course, notoriously carbon poor. We are on the oldest continent, but that means there's enormous opportunity to grow both agricultural productivity and sequester carbon at the same time. And last but not least, Australian farms, compared to many in the world, are very low density. There is plenty of room for carbon farming and for planting woody or deep-rooted plants to capture carbon and actually make a profit from it as well. There are, of course, some threats, though. It's not going to be all terribly easy and to be taken for granted that the opportunities will be able to be realised for Australian farmers. There are two sort of potential threats that I see emerging from, particularly from the sort of Northern Hemisphere trade-related climate policy. One of those is that although Australian agriculture actually can meet green standards, that it's difficult or costly for them to prove that. So as economists, we talk about an excess regulatory burden. The way to respond to that is through a combination of both public and private initiatives. The Australian and government, state and federal have a real role to play in helping reduce regulatory burden by getting involved in the design or co-design of low burden, trusted regulatory and embedded emissions accounting systems. Another potential threat, which the agricultural sector is all too aware of, is if the tyranny of distance strikes again, and particularly the Northern Hemisphere once again start claiming that Australia's food miles mean that their products are less environmentally sound. The good news here is that technology and industrial policy are combining, and we are now seeing the development of zero zero emissions transport systems. So we're seeing ammonia and synthetic methanol being proposed, and in fact the first ships being developed and built where ammonia can be produced entirely from renewable energy, so at zero emissions fuel. Similarly, we can create synthetic jet fuels. They're expensive, but this is something that in the decades to come, you're going to expect to see more and more of. And of course, we can electrify road transport through battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. All of these things can help decarbonise our transport and our supply chains to get to those lucrative international markets. So, in conclusion, increased climate mitigation ambition around the world is leading to a rapidly changing global market for agricultural products. Australian farmers can, however, really profit from these changes. We have so many natural and human capital advantages. In order for us to take these advantages, though, we will need to be proactive innovators and will need a supportive policy and regulatory environment. Thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thank you so much, Emma. Well, our next panellist is Sue McCluskey. She is the inaugural Special Representative for Australian Agriculture. Sue is an experienced Senior Business Executive and Company Director, and she farms beef at Yass. Welcome, Sue.
Good morning to everyone who has joined the 2022 ABARES Outlook Conference and to my fellow panellists in this session on trading in a greener environment. Can Australia's agricultural exports maintain competitive advantage? First, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce my role. Then I'll focus on how Australian agriculture has been positioning itself on sustainability and opportunities to influence global trade. I'm the first Special Representative for Australian agriculture. This role was created by the Australian Government in 2021 under a broader program to step up Australia's contribution to the multilateral institutions and global policy debates that underpin agricultural trade. I'll be meeting with Australian industry across the country and representing Australia overseas in multilateral and bilateral settings. These meetings will give me the opportunity to promote Australia's commitment to sustainable agriculture and talk about the benefits of our open trade settings to the agriculture sector and rural communities. I'll also champion the values of the multilateral rules-based trade system that supports global food security, reduces uncertainty, and drives economic growth. It's also an opportunity to highlight the important role of science and risk in international standard setting and promoting rules with an outcome focus. We recognise there's no one-size-fits-all model of agricultural production and sustainability. We want to encourage standards and rules that position the desired outcome as the foremost requirement. How individual producers and countries achieve that outcome will be up to them, so that they can farm to their unique set of circumstances to deliver those outcomes. I look forward to meeting with many of you and listening to your views, engaging with multilateral and bilateral partners, and bringing those perspectives and insights back home. As this audience well knows, Australia's access to agriculture export markets is underpinned by the multilateral trading system. It has been credited as the system that has dampened the volatility that made nations vulnerable to poverty and food insecurity. And it has demonstrably improved the economic welfare of many countries. It's the system that Australia, as a mid-sized economy, has benefited from economically, creating opportunities for our farmers to export their produce. I think it's a system that can work to drive adoption of sustainable production. Indeed, good faith engagement in and consensus in multilateral institutions such as the WTO and the 3 international standard-setting bodies, Codex, IPPC and the OIE, are preconditions for transitioning to global sustainable food production. Right now, we see a growing domestic and international consumer demand for food and agricultural products that can be verified as higher welfare and environmentally sustainable. Japan, for instance, has set a target of sustainably produced imports for food manufacturers by 2030. The EU is working on a definition of a sustainable food system and will consider a sustainability label for agri-food products placed on retail shelves in future. These are just two examples where governments, importers, manufacturers and retailers are increasingly adopting a sustainability agenda driven by consumer demand. Of course, Australia has very strong sustainable agriculture credentials. We have a great story to tell of the work farmers are doing to adapt to our highly variable climate. Farmers are constantly improving their farm management practices to increase productivity, profitability and the natural capital of their land. In fact, 94% of farmers are actively undertaking natural resource management. All our major commodities have implemented or are developing a sustainability framework. Innovation and on-farm management practice changes mean that many sustainable practices have become the norm. For example, over 95% of Australian farms use minimum or no-till farming. Farmers have developed ways to manage their farms sustainably, with tree planting regimes and fencing off riparian areas to protect waterways, plus many farmers destock during dry periods to maintain ground cover. The results of our sustainability practice and on-farm innovation are there for the world to see. To call out just a few examples. Recent CSIRO research found that in grains, Australia exhibits lower greenhouse gas emissions for each tonne produced than the EU, the US, Canada, Russia and Ukraine. Our rice growers produce the highest volume per hectare globally and are using 50% less water than the global average. Our cotton farmers have reduced synthetic insecticide use by 97% since 1992 and are focused on water efficiency. Of around 4,000 sugar farms, 80% are farmed in line with the Best Management Practice program. And our red meat sector has a world-leading ambition to be carbon neutral by 2030. And you can already buy steak and sausages in Australia from a carbon neutral supply chain. Plus, I'd like to recognise the National Farmers Federation's Real Climate Action campaign, where farmers tell their own stories about how they are looking after their land and animals. So our sustainability credentials are there. The question is, how can we demonstrate our compliance with the new and emerging sustainability requirements off the market efficiently and in a cost-effective way? How can we work with trading partners to develop a system of rules and standards in which sustainable production is prioritised, recognised and certified, perhaps in the same way that food safety is prioritised, recognised and certified? It is not clear what form trade rules may potentially take to support sustainable production. But I know the message Australia will bring is that all sustainability standards need to be derived through science-based approaches with respect to environmental circumstances. The world just cannot afford the simplification of a one-size-fits-all approach to agricultural production when it is so much more complex. In Australia, our climate is highly variable. We have unique biodiversity to protect. We have lower mean rainfall and old dry soils. Our systems of agricultural production, innovation and sustainability approaches reflect those unique circumstances. We need an effective trading system along with the institutions, scientists and policy experts to sensibly work through how sustainable production is going to be defined, certified, approved and marketed. Australia is ready as an active participant to contribute to this important discussion and work in good faith at the WTO, the three international standard-setting bodies, at the OECD, FAO and other fora, as these new global trade settings are built. We need a multilateral system where standards and rules are developed that account for the global diversity of production environment, production practices and production outcomes, that account for the role of science and risk. Australian producers have already shown their readiness to work with change, to work with reform, the development of industry sustainability frameworks and the building of metrics of success in Australian agriculture are the focus of a range of existing industry and research and government efforts. Australia also continues to explore innovative ways to improve and promote the adoption of efficient, profitable, sustainable land management practices, including through environmental market-based mechanisms. I'm pleased that in my new role I will have the opportunity for raising the importance of multilateral institutions and principles. But more than that, it's also a chance to speak to others about how Australian government, industry and farmers are working together to make the changes needed to not only keep competitive advantage, but further contribute to sustainably produced food and fibre for our world. Thank you very much for this opportunity to add to this complex discussion. I wish you all a successful conference and look forward to continuing future engagement.
Thanks so much, Sue. Our third panellist today is Cornelis Keijzer. He's the Minister Councillor from the delegation of the European Union to Australia. Keys is a very experienced diplomat and trade negotiator. Welcome, Keys.
Hello, my name is Cornelis Keijzer. I work in the European Union delegation in Canberra. I would like to share some thoughts today about agriculture in the European Union, how we see it, what is the future of agriculture, and how we deal with the challenges in agriculture at this moment, and also how we want to cooperate with other countries on these issues. So the Farm to Fork strategy is the proposal by the Commission for a fair, healthy and environmentally friendly food system. And it is part of our Green Deal objective. Now, the Green Deal is a broader approach to combat climate change in particular and to make Europe greener. There are a lot of sectors involved, also industry, of course, and transport, try to eliminate pollution, promote clean energy. But as far as agriculture is concerned, from farm to fork is the approach to deal with the challenges in agriculture. The challenges that we are facing in our food system are very similar across the world. They're not unique to Europe, but the way we see it is that there are issues of social sustainability. We need healthier diets, reduce overweight. I'm working on that myself. Improve animal welfare, improve the social rights of workers in the food chain, and keep food affordable. Then, very importantly, also the environmental aspect, of course, because we are trying to tackle climate change. That's the whole objective. We need to protect the environment, preserve biodiversity, reduce food losses and waste, and we propose to come to a circular bio-based economy. Economic sustainability is always important as well, of course. Fair incomes for farmers, a just transition, and new business and job opportunities. Farm to Fork has a number of overall goals. We try to reduce the environmental and climate footprint of the food system and lead a global transition towards competitive sustainability from farm to fork. So more specifically, we have targets for a sustainable food production. In 2030, we propose to reduce by 50% the use of chemical pesticides. Also, we propose to reduce nutrient losses by at least 50% to ensure that there's no deterioration in the soil fertility. We also propose to reduce the sales of antimicrobials for farmed animals by 50%. And then we'd like to have more of agricultural land under organic farming, and we'd like by 2030 that to be 25%. Pesticides, we've already reduced the use of pesticides by 20% in the period here in the review, and we'd like to bring that by 2030 to 50%, so less pesticides. On the nutrient losses, there is a balance necessary for the soil, and while the nitrogen surplus has remained more or less stable over time, the phosphorus surplus has decreased. We need a balance there, and by 2030, we'd like to reduce the nutrient losses by at least 50%. And antimicrobial resistance. The use of antibiotics in agriculture is far too high. We've already decreased it by a third. We'd like to decrease it by 50% in 2030, as excessive and inappropriate use of antimicrobials is unhealthy, both for humans and animals. Then, as I said, we need more. We propose to have more land dedicated to organic farming in the European Union. We are moving up, as you see in the period under review, but we want to bring this to 25% of the total. Now, in Farm to Fork, there are a lot of stakeholders involved. Here you see all of them. So we need to reach out to all of these and include everyone in this strategy. What I would like to specifically mention is the international aspect of Farm to Fork. So we're looking to cooperate with other countries. The European Union cannot do it alone. We need to work with like-minded countries for a common vision. And we do that multilaterally in the World Trade Organization, the Sustainability Agenda, and we are seeking in G20 to become climate neutral, and we're building a green alliance to achieve that. We also want to promote international standards for food. That is what we do multilaterally. We're using the free trade agreements, including the one we're negotiating with Australia, as a platform for cooperation towards sustainable food systems. So I'd like to say a few words about the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism as well. This is a proposal by the European Commission. It's not yet in force, but the idea is to price imports of put a carbon price on imports of selected products to avoid carbon leakage. So we want to avoid that by our environmental policies and the carbon pricing, that we push carbon intensive production outside the EU, which of course defeats the purpose. EU importers will have to buy carbon certificates against the carbon price payable in the EU. So there's equal treatment, and that is why the CBAM is compliant with the WTO and other international obligations of the EU. And it is not a protectionist device. It is a device to realize our goals on climate change. It will apply to iron and steel, cement, fertilizer, aluminium, and electricity generation. Those sectors together are a very small part of Australia's export to the European Union. I think that it is somewhere around 0.25% of those exports. So Australia will not be affected very much because it simply does not export the products that are included, and it will not apply to agricultural products. And I cannot see well that it will be applied anywhere in the near future, because the agriculture is in the European Union not subject to the exchange trading system. So as this is intended to be to reduce, to eliminate inequality, if we don't apply it internally, we cannot apply it to importers either. So it does not apply to agricultural products. Now, we do propose to have better and stricter regulation for food products, for consumer protection, and also for sustainability. That is the goal, and we think that Australia can actually have a competitive advantage in this, because if you look at it, what competitor of Australia on international markets is better placed to introduce higher food standards? Australia already applies very high regulatory standards with a very similar focus as the European Union in animal and crop production. And Australian agricultural products are well regarded international for high health and purity standards. So we think that working together with Australia on this is logical and can lead to a competitive advantage of Australia. Including these environmental standards in its strategy will only provide a further large advantage into the EU market. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Emma and Sue, really great presentations, a lot for us there to be thinking about. Pretty exciting time to be talking about green standards and a lot of happening. So maybe Emma, I'll turn to you first. You talked about the opportunities, you talked about the threats. There is a threat that greener trading rules could become costly for exporters, and inconsistent standards will be applied across countries and sometimes to restrict trade. How can we avoid this and ensure that the costs are minimised, that the green trade rules are applied consistently and are rewarding those cleaner products without harming trade?
Thanks a lot, Jo, and thanks to my fellow panellists for really fascinating presentations. I'd like to say firstly that I'm really happy to see the agreement all round on two important points. One, that good quality rules will help us achieve both our environmental and our economic objectives. And secondly, that Australia actually has a competitive advantage in high quality and environmental exports. I think that's great to see. So what do we need to do to make sure we realise that advantage? Unfortunately, for the bureaucrats on the call, I think a lot of hard work, working in great detail, very closely with our partners in the European Union and elsewhere. And that involves work not only for track 1.0 diplomacy, but also track 1.5 and 2.0, getting the research communities on both sides to talk to each other and help nut through what is actually inevitably going to be quite a complex set of rules. And I think if the government and the research community take on the burden of figuring out those complexities, then they can deliver something to our producers that is not too complex from their perspective. And that's really important because that lets them get on with the job of feeding us all and helping to save us from climate change.
Thanks, Emma. Sorry, can I just ask you to unpack for us the track 1.5 and the track 2? I'm not sure everyone will be familiar with that terminology.
Yeah, absolutely. So track 2.0 diplomacy is where researchers or non-government actors from two different negotiating parties are working together on things. And 1.5 is a little bit like the sort of mixture we have today, where you have research and government, or industry and government mixed together, working together on things. And I do think that cross-sectoral approach is really important as well. A great example that I'm involved in is the Australia-Germany ice supply, so not regarding agriculture, but also looking at how can we support Australian exports of green hydrogen to the European Union, or Germany in particular in this case. And what we're seeing is, there's a lot of really nitty-gritty detail that I am able to get involved with my German counterpart, because we are just genuinely, we're not representing the countries as such, we're representing, best practice, and we can be very open with our information exchange and design, mutually best outcomes, and really get into a lot of detail that, government doesn't always have time to do. So I think we're going to see a lot of that, and I think the Australian government is really on track with that as well. The Australia-Singapore Green Economy Agreement is a great example of it as well, and I really applaud those efforts. I look forward to working with government on, we have a joint linkage application on embedded emissions accounting systems. So all of these things are ways in which across sectors we can work together, as Team Australia, but also, quite frankly, Team World.
Fantastic. Sue, I might turn to you now. Can you maybe give us a bit of your thinking in terms of what are the different respective roles for government and industry as we get on these tracks and actually work together to negotiate the different models?
Thanks, Joe, and likewise, thanks to my fellow panellists. Look, I think a message we've heard come through quite consistently is that we all need to work together, and that collaborative approach is just going to be so important, because in the end, we're on the same page, or as I like to say, we've got the same destination, we've just got different routes to get there. And that's particularly important because government will have a policy focus, industry will have a practical focus. And so working together, we are actually better able to get the outcomes that we want and have that coordinated approach. So we have the policy outcomes that reflect what can actually work in practice, recognising, of course, that one size doesn't fit all. And I think that industry and government working together can really play a leadership role in both advocacy and just the importance of the standard setting bodies. And we also are able to articulate much more clearly what are the challenges and risks that we face in different approaches, and just how we can actually work together and make sure that our voices are heard and we have a seat at the table. So certainly, we come from different perspectives, but we're all on the same page, as I said, and working together, I think, is going to be the most powerful way that we can give clear, consistent messaging about where we want to end up.
Fantastic. Keys, I'll turn to you now. I know the EU's got a really strong focus on building a global alliance. You talked about it in your presentation, to work with other nations on this challenge. What's your experience so far, and where are you focusing?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for those really interesting presentations. I've heard a lot of interesting things, and I'm very encouraged by what everybody says about working together and cooperating, and that's what we intend to do. I mean, one of the ways of working specifically with Australia is through the free trade agreement, where we envisage a chapter on sanitary and phytosanitary standards that includes animal welfare. So we will work with Australia using the FTA as a platform. And even after the FTA is concluded, we can continue that discussion in the relevant committee. Also, our goal is definitely to work together with Australia in setting up international standards in the World Health Organization for Animal Health. So that is also very important to have coordinate our inputs there and set up good international standards. Which is true that different standards will be confusing and costly. So we have to come to international standards that are globally applied. That is that is what we are striving for.
Thank you. Look, I'm going to questions from the floor now, and I see we've already answered the most upvoted question, so well done to us as a panel. Where does the panel see the fledgling Australian agricultural sustainability framework fitting in? This is a piece of work that's been funded by government, being done by NFF and also the Australian Farm Institute. Maybe, Sue, I'll turn to you first on that question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Great question. And look, this is going to be such an important framework that's going to be able to clearly articulate just Australian agriculture's commitment to sustainability. And I think, look, we all know it, and across a whole range of different industry sectors, there is so much that is being put into practice. But what the sustainability framework does is actually clearly articulates the parameters within which we can operate and the directions that we want to go. And that will then be translated on the ground by different industries. And a lot of them, as I said, are putting these into place. This is going to be fantastic for me in my new role as I go around, around the world talking to different countries and being able to really be able to demonstrate Australia's sustainability credentials. We heard both Emma and Keys refer to the fact that Australia's got a great story to tell. We do, but I think we just need to be able to make sure we can keep telling that great story and give the really good examples. So for me, the sustainability framework is just a really key tool in being able to say, yes, we have this framework in place, and yes, this is what we're doing on the ground to make it, to give life to that framework. Thanks, Jo.
Thank you. Keith, I'm turning to you now. I'm conscious you've got a common agricultural policy, you've got a measurement framework. Is that how the EU is thinking about showing its sustainability credentials? And are there other models? Obviously, the ISCC certification framework, which we use for our canola exports to the EU, exists. It's effectively a private standard arrangement. Welcome your comments in relation to those. How's the EU going to demonstrate its credentials and the use of private standards in the model?
Thank you. Well, those are things that we are definitely working on, and the farm to fork strategy that sets out some of the objectives. Now we have to put that into place. So there's work is going on that, and I think that staying in touch and coordinating these things is very important to come to international standards. So we are working on this. Australia is doing work. Let's coordinate our efforts and come to a good outcome.
That sounds like a good plan. Emma, I want to turn to you and ask you, what are your suggestions for low-cost ways countries can demonstrate sustainability? What are the low-cost measures that we should be looking to build as a sustainability certification system going forward for trade?
Thanks a lot, Jo. Actually, I might angle my answer at the discussion we've just been having. So there's a few different approaches. One we've talked about, which is to have mutually agreed global standards, which of course is the gold standard in how to approach these things, but it's not always possible, and sometimes the negotiations to get to those sort of mutually agreed global standards can drag on longer than we necessarily have to deal with climate change. So there are alternative approaches. Of course, people would be familiar with the concept of mutual recognition, where one partner says, okay, the other partner's standard is high enough for us, we'll accept that as equivalent to ours. But there is a third option which is seriously under consideration, even for something much simpler, which is hydrogen, which is what's called a mutual recognition agreement. And that means you don't need to accept each other's standards as such, but you do need to accept that there are competent bodies, acceptable auditors, if you like, that are based in the other market that can sort of certify to your standards. And the big advantage of that is if there is, some sort of auditing firm that can help an Australian farmer prove that they meet Australian standards, that farmer can essentially give that same information to that same party, and that party can then do the work of proving that they're meeting, for example, the European standards. And that in itself, because that's the really time-consuming bit, gathering the information, working on the ground to prove things. So I think, as a lowest bar, that is sort of the quickest and easiest way that we could reduce, ensure that we keep regulatory burdens low for our primary producers.
Fantastic. Mutual recognition, always a much admired policy tool, particularly for competent authorities as we deal with each other and give assurance about the food safety and quality we have to do. Look, we've got a lot of interest, Sue, in your role. So a question for you: how will you be involved as the special representative for Australian Ag in the FTA negotiations or in helping overcome technical barriers to trade?
So it probably behoves me to actually say that I won't be injecting myself, directly into trade negotiations. That's not my role directly with the FTAs. It's DFAT's role, basically. But I certainly will be operating at the multilateral level around the edges, but certainly providing a very strong evidence-based approach to the rules-based system and the standards, and the impact that they may have on the trade negotiations will certainly be something that I will be involved with. I also won't necessarily be engaged directly in bilateral negotiations, but I will have my ears and eyes open around what's happening in the bilateral sphere, because there could be implications at the multilateral level. And of course, where there is an opportunity to ensure that there are examples that we can learn from, as well as be able to promote what we're doing here in Australia, that may be also relevant in a bilateral sense. And I just want to draw on something that Emma also just said around the mutual recognition agreements, and the way that can reduce regulatory burden. I think regulatory burden is something that we're always conscious of. And yet, when we start to develop our trade negotiations, it tends to be about individual protection for patches. Whereas if we can actually say, no, this is about co-design and how we actually looking towards that common outcome, then we actually can recognise there will be differences, but the broader outcome is what we're trying to get. So I think that's the role I will have on the edge of those trade negotiations, but not directly involved with them.
Thanks, Sue. Great to clarify that one. Look, I'm conscious, I want to pick up something that was brought up by a number of you in relation to level playing field rules. I'm conscious that the mutual recognition agreement sounds like a really great way to go. It's low cost, it's low hanging fruit. It's obviously a bilateral arrangement as opposed to the multilateral. But, as you pointed out, Emma, it is natural for farmers to feel that they want to have a level playing field. We talk about that for our farmers. I know the EU talks about that a lot. Maybe, Keijzer, if I turn to you first, what does level playing field mean for EU farmers, and how do you think that plays out in a mutual recognition arrangement, rather than possibly some of the kind of current conversation here, which is of course about mirror clauses, which is really not necessarily a mutual recognition model, more a model where, same practices, same outcomes. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, mutual recognition is traditionally an alternative to international standards that are exactly the same. I do have to say that in the European Union we have certain requirements that will not be compromised on. For example, there can be no hormones in meat. So if farmers in Australia want to export to the European Union, they have to comply to these European standards. And they can, and they do. I've visited slaughterhouses where there are specific EU production lines, and the advantage of that is that they can also be exported to, for example, China, because the EU standard is the highest standard, and once you meet that, you can actually produce for all markets. So that is a way of a mutual recognition, but we have to see whether that is something that we can use. But it requires, of course, a certain alignment on issues of biosecurity. Thanks.
Thanks. And Emma, I'm going to turn to you. Are you able to comment on that level playing field rules idea?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it is important to recognise the difference between differences in actual sort of level of standards and complexity of proving that you meet that standard. And I just need to emphasise that again, that obviously the European Union has the right, the sovereign right, well, the countries within it, to set their standards that their democratic processes have decided are appropriate for them, and we have no right to demand that we be allowed to export lower quality products, especially if their farmers are going to the extra cost of meeting those high standards. So I think we're all in fierce agreement about that, and so it's just important to clarify that that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is making sure that it's not more complicated for Australian farmers to prove their standards than it is for the European farmers. And so that's also an element of level playing field. And I did want to make one other comment, noting that carbon border adjustment mechanisms are not currently on the table because the agricultural sector is not part of the emissions trading scheme. That, of course, Certification is great as a, as a voluntary thing. It can help, but ultimately, when you're facing catastrophic climate change and the need to decarbonise very rapidly, we are going to need binding standards, and we are going to need real strong price signals in markets. So I think we just have to accept that there's no getting around that.
Well, that's a very clear signal to our audience today about the kind of changes that you see coming. And clearly, Keijzer has talked about the farm to fork strategy, and there are very clear signals and expectations coming to EU farmers and to trading partners about it. Look, I'm conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes left. I think one of the questions that we've got here is, can the panel tell us more about what the Australian government can be doing to help our ag sector to take advantage of the climate-driven developments in the global trading regime? I might turn to Sue first on that one.
Look, there's a lot being done by the Australian government in this area across a whole range of different perspectives, really. I think that the main thing that I will probably turn to is if we look at more broadly where the government's funding different initiatives. So there's initiatives being undertaken through the National Farmers Federation, for example, development of the sustainability framework that was mentioned earlier. Also what the R&D corporations are doing in this area. There's been a wealth of work done in the research and development, and certainly the industries are being able to benefit from what they're actually doing on the ground. And I guess my role will be to be able to articulate that. I don't speak just for the Australian government. I like to think of my role as being across government and industry, and that actually makes it for me an easier role, because I'm not just speaking for the government and I'm not just speaking for industry, but I have the ability to be able to bridge that gap. And so I'll be drawing on what the government is actually doing in this space, but also what industry wants and how we can actually make that happen. And so I think that's why I keep coming back to that coordinated approach, because for me it does mean that we've got to look at both those perspectives. We can't just take one perspective on its own. So that probably doesn't go all the way to answering your question, Jo, but I'm very conscious that I'm not an Australian government official in, speaking on behalf of the government, but I can actually, look at what this role will bring.
Brilliant, thank you. No, very, very well understood. Emma, I want to turn to you on this question in relation to where do you think the Australian government should be taking action?
Look, I think I applaud the action that they are taking on things like the Singapore-Australia Green Economy Agreement and similar initiatives elsewhere. If you think about it, if the government can set up systems that, make the effort to figure out on the farmers' behalf what they need to do to prove that they can meet the standards of their export markets, that's taking a huge amount of the burden off the farmers. So setting up systems that Australian farmers can then, just sit down at the computer and enter it, at 10 o'clock at night probably, without having to figure out what certification they need and how to prove that they meet the standards of 10 different foreign markets. And so that's the other thing that I keep coming back to. If we have systems in Australia where the farmers can enter the information in one place, and that can be used to generate, proof of meeting standards and certifications in multiple markets, that's a huge win. And that's the reason that we're working with, hopefully, if it comes through, we've applied to work with the Climate Change Authority, Clean Energy Regulator, and DFAT on, for example, an embedded emissions accounting system that would be whole economy and would actually even integrate the agricultural sector into an emissions accounting scheme that would allow them to prove easily that sort of credential.
Fantastic. And Keijzer, do you want to comment from the EU perspective? There's clearly a huge amount of work being done to reorient your common agricultural policy to change on-farm practice, and obviously a huge research fund there with Horizon Europe.
Well, that was exactly the thing that I wanted to mention, because we've heard a lot of interesting things already, and Sue and Emma have mentioned a number of important things. And I wanted to mention research. There's very interesting research going on in Australia in the agricultural sector and in Europe as well. And one way of benefiting and sharing that result would be for Australia to associate with Horizon Europe, and that would give a lot of possibilities to work together and share results and make sure that we use the results of scientific research on agriculture. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we're right on time. Panelists, thank you so much for the conversation today. And thank you to the audience for joining us and to asking the questions. Just really quickly, a short survey will pop up soon. We really welcome your feedback. Don't forget to please chat to our spotlight exhibitors who will be online for the next half hour. Please do keep this conversation going in the virtual networking room. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much to the panel today, and good morning.